There we go. Hi, my name is Donna Yates, and I, as previously stated, there we go. I'm from the University of Glasgow. To explain myself a little bit in the few minutes that I have, I am an archaeologist, but for the past 4 years, I have been working in a criminology department with the previously mentioned Trafficking Culture Project. And our goal has actually been to approach some of the very questions that Allison just named, conveniently enough, to apply criminological and sociological frameworks and analytical techniques to try to understand the trafficking of antiquities, and also to try to understand what's gone wrong with policy and how we can make policy better. And that's what I'm going to focus on for my 7 minutes, is what's gone wrong with policy and potentially how we can make it better. So obviously, we've heard this today. Looting has been a long-term project throughout the world in a variety of places, not just conflict zones. It's come back in the news recently again. And this kind of keeps happening. We kind of see the same patterns over and over and over again. And yet, the policy response we tend to have at a high level and even at a local level repeats the same kind of structure that we've had for the past 40 years. Clearly, it doesn't work. Our policy tends to be reactive. It's not proactive. We craft policy in response to major problems. Essentially, we're trying to put spilt milk back in a cup instead of preventing the cup from falling over in the first place. Our policy doesn't actually tend to address the practical realities of this type of illicit commodity. We tend to craft policy that requires us to know exactly which country an artifact came from, after exactly what date. And there's an example from UNSCR 2199. Iraq since 6 August 1990, Syria since 15 March 2011. But if you've just discovered, say, this figurine in New York, can you tell what country it came from? Can you tell when it left the country? Can you prove it? Can you prove it in a court of law? If you can't, that object's not going back, and you can pretty much never prove it. Our pocket policy tends to focus on supply, not just policy, I'm talking about intervention and response, rather than focusing on demand. And demand causes supply. Artifacts are looted because people will buy them. And at this point, most of our national and international policy should be focusing on demand and reducing demand, but it doesn't. And if I was going to give a longer talk today, I would go very much into why this kind of supply-focused policy doesn't work, but 7 minutes. Really, it is exceedingly hard to craft high-level policy that takes into account all of the intricacies of all of the developing world, all of the developed world, all of the source countries, all of the market. Yet, in a lot of respects, the developing source countries are our first line of defense when it comes to preventing the illicit trafficking of objects. Assumptions are made about the logistical capabilities of these countries, and they don't often reflect on-the-ground reality. Yet again, this is our first line of defense, and as we've seen again in a number of different presentations, if the objects leave the country, it is very unlikely that they will ever return. I'll skip over that. Again, longer talk if you guys would like to see it. But these really big issues come up, and I'll go through. So the burden on developing countries. So as I said, the current international regulatory regime depends on-the-ground policing in developing countries. This is a huge financial burden, and it's a disproportionate financial burden. There's a requirement for qualified staff sufficient in number that, again, doesn't reflect reality. The result is policy that is extremely difficult to enforce on the ground due to financial shortfalls and institutional failure. And the expectation that source countries should be the primary policing line for the prevention of the trafficking of antiquities, I say may prevent, but actually does prevent the apprehension of criminals who are higher up on the antiquity smuggling network, and doesn't really reflect breaking up these networks, and certainly doesn't reflect reducing market demand. We focus on countries, not objects. Like I said, our international regulatory system requires on countries working in partnership, often two countries, even though it might be a multi-country network of antiquities trafficking. And as trafficked objects pass through several other states, they may go through jurisdictions that don't have a vested interest in preventing trafficking. And as I previously stated, the country of origin of many objects can't be determined anyway. Another issue that has come up in a previous talk is that cultural objects are not necessarily the only things that are, the trafficking of cultural objects are connected to other crimes. The same people who engage in various types of subsistence looting, subsistence trafficking, engage in other illicit and non-illicit subsistence economies. And our decisions made to regulate those objects may actually affect the regulation and the prevention of antiquities trafficking, but very little work has been done on this, so we don't know much about it. So, what would bold new policy entail? Just because this system is embedded, just because the system is embedded doesn't mean that we have no other options. In trying to envision bold new policy, we on the Trafficking Culture Project over the past 4 years, based off of our field research, have come up with several things. First, object-focused import restrictions should be promoted. This idea that we must identify the country of origin of objects or the date that it left a certain country simply doesn't work, and I'll get to that in a second. We need to target traffickers and buyers, not on-the-ground looters, and we don't need to waste too much time and effort on a limited number of expensive, high-profile returns at the expense of not actually going after traffickers and buyers. And to do this, we need evaluation because, quite frankly, we don't know what works. We keep implementing the same policy, but it isn't effectively evaluated or tested, and we need to accept those results. We need to borrow on successes because antiquities aren't that special when it comes to the trafficking of illicit commodities. And there have been quite some good policy successes for curbing, say, the trafficking of ivory or rhinoceros horns. So one obvious example of something we can do is have a universal permitting system for the movement of antiquities and art. The UNESCO offers a model permit, that's great, but the countries can decide if they're going to adopt that. If we had an international system, again, much like we have for wildlife, it would be exceedingly difficult to fake that. Previously said objects, not origin dates, and this is something you'll hear all of us in the Trafficking Culture Project say over and over again, is we need to focus on market reduction. Just because there is a market for something doesn't mean that it's a valid commodity, and we don't have to accept that antiquities are valid commodities on the market. And this goes into a lot of our research that I could talk about, about white-collar crime and so on and so forth. But we do need to radically regulate and radically reduce the market, and there are ways to do that. And this will anger people, but we should be prepared for that. And I will end it there. Thank you very much. And everyone can have lunch now.
Thank you, Donna.